I'm delighted to be here. I'm delighted to see that there's participation from around the world, it looks like. And you keep putting in the chat just where you're tuning in from. This conversation is going to be largely a retrospective. Every conservation group has its own unique evolutionary tale. I think that the story of rare's evolution is especially interesting and instructive. And there's no one who knows more about it or can tell it better than Paul Butler, who is who's been at the center of rare's evolution. Paul is the genius behind rare's. Hey, Paul, and I have to tell you, just a second. Look what I'm wearing.
Oh wow!
I don't know where I took it up. It tells a little bit about the evolution of rare because it's some of the logos from past years. But Paul's been at the center of, or he's been the genius behind rare's signature pride campaigns, and he's beloved by hundreds of campaign managers around the world, or local heroes as he always calls them, and whom he's mentored and trained. And he's beloved and respected as well by many in the bingo community, the big environmental NGOs, for his role in partnering with them in how to do community-based conservation. And I suspect that many of them are tuned into this webinar, and we welcome you. And as I say, it would be great to know just who you are in the chat. So I think Paul has been called Parrot Man. He's been called a catalyst, change agent, designer. I call Paul the soul of rare. And this is a rare opportunity to hear directly from him on how this tiny little group started, largely based in the Caribbean, to a worldwide organization whose work and influence encircles the globe and has taken behavior change to a whole new level. And first, I just want to say a little bit about how Paul and I met, because I think in person, it was, I think, Paul, around 2001 in New York, at a reception. I think Tony Randolph had it at her place. And I'd heard about this group, didn't know anything about them. And I thought, okay, well, I think it was for a friend-raising event. And I went and talked to Paul a little bit, and it started stirring something in my memory. And I went home and found this magazine. You could put that up. I think there's a slide of the magazine, Smithsonian Magazine in 1994, where the article had really struck me. You can take that off too, but thank you. With a toucan on the front, and it said, "The big bird of Belize, a national symbol of pride in nature." And it struck me so because I was reading about this guy who developed campaigns where people dressed up as creatures. And at the time, I was dressing up as red-winged blackbirds and monarch butterflies as the nature lady in my hometown in Illinois. But I was just fascinated, and I cared enough that I saved the issue. And I went back and saw it. I said, "That's the guy I just met." And from there, we've been friends for all these years, for more than 20 years. And I just want to read just a little excerpt here that the writer, he was talking about these classrooms in Belize at that point, where the mascot was a keel-billed toucan. And the kids were listening to a song, Our Keel-billed Bird. But it said, but they were staring goggle-eyed at this Belizean big bird. That is, when they can tear their eyes away from the school's other astonishing visitor, a skinny, long-haired Englishman in thongs and supremely baggy slacks, doing his own dervish dance off to one side of the room. And I thought we'd go back, Paul, to those because that was post the beginning of your beginning with rare. But take us back to when you were called often Parrot Man in the Caribbean. This actually, I think, coincided. Rare was beginning apart from you at the time in the 70s, but you were down in St. Lucia. And take us back to that time and tell us just a little bit about how you got there, why you were there, and how that led to your involvement with rare.
Sure. Well, rare's been around for about 50 years. I joined it 7 or 8 years after it began, well, no, a bit more than 10 years after it began with the founder of David Hill, who was a pilot, an avid birder, and a visionary proponent for conservation. And he had established this organization, which I actually first heard about when I was with the forestry department in St. Lucia. So after graduating from college, I wanted to get some experience because my CV looked pretty naked. And so I decided with some colleagues to run an expedition to St. Lucia. We chose St. Lucia because it was English speaking, although it also speak patois, but it was English speaking, which meant I could do something. It had charter flights, which meant it was cheap to get to. It was an island, so if we were only there for a short period of time, hopefully we would see what we were looking for. And we wanted a species that donors would recognize, and they had an endemic parrot. And so I ended up in the island of St. Lucia in the Eastern Caribbean, where we did a parrot count and made some recommendations to the government. And to my astonishment, the government, the forestry department, then headed by Gabriel Charles, asked if I would return and implement the recommendations. I was somewhat stunned to be asked to implement recommendations, but those included revising the legislation because it was very, very outdated. It dated back to 1885, setting up a parrot sanctuary, and really building an awareness for the parrot primarily, which at that time was flickering on the edge of extinction, and also its forest habitat. And so I spent 10 years with the forestry department, absolutely wonderful people there. Gabriel Charles is my hero and my mentor, but other people like Michael Bobb and Adams Toussaint, and later Aline Regis, Lyndon John, these are my heroes. And they inspired me to the work we did. And together, we put together a program to protect the parrot.
And when I first visited St. Lucia, probably, I don't know, 8 or 10 years later, it was back. It had been, I think World Wildlife Fund said that it was going to be winking out by the year 2000.
Yes, there was a quote back in the 70s that it couldn't escape oblivion, was the exact quote.
Yeah.
So things were pretty dire because people were hunting it, they were keeping it as pets, and of course deforestation was ravaging its habitat.
Yeah, and we had no trouble finding them once. But tell us a little bit about the components that led to that recovery of the bird.
Well, it's when I started back 50 years ago in conservation, almost 50 years, the conservation toolbox was pretty sparse. Really, people set aside protected areas, often fenced, not in the Caribbean, but elsewhere, and put in place legislation and basically, arrested anyone that entered the reserve. And that was the conservation toolbox. It wouldn't really work in a small island like St. Lucia. And what I thought we really needed to do, and when I say we, I mean the forestry department, Gabriel Charles, etc., was that we needed to get people to become aware that they had something special and unique. Most people had either never heard of the parrot or thought it was the same parrot that was found in Guyana. There was certainly no love or passion for it. So we wanted to build a pride in this species. It's endemic. It's only found in St. Lucia, nowhere else in the world. And what was interesting was my arrival there was only shortly afterwards, St. Lucia became independent. So it was a perfect time to declare a national bird. And then obviously, if you've just declared a national bird, you don't really want it to become extinct a couple of weeks later. And so what we wanted to do was put in place a program that included everything, working with churches, working with musicians, working with school children, working with community leaders, to build a sense of pride around this species and the habitat that it lived in.
And song, you mentioned, songs were very central to the Pride campaigns. Also, and the Jacko Express too, the Jacko Express. So tell us a little bit about those.
Well, social marketer Mackenzie Moore writes, all persuasion begins with capturing attention. Without attention, persuasion's impossible. And the material should not be inconspicuous and boring. And what we wanted to do was the complete opposite, make it fun, make it engaging. And obviously songs, going in a big costume that you saw, it's engaging, it captures people's attention. And that really is what we wanted to do, is capture people's attention. So yes, the local people we worked with in the forestry department, Aline Regis, would go into every single school, accompanied by a costumed parrot, and jump up and down and wave a very big slingshot to the children and say these shouldn't be used. And the same working with religious leaders. Many of the islands in the Caribbean are very religious. And so working with Catholic in St. Lucia and other islands. Yes, we used every tool that we could think of to add to that toolbox that I was talking about.
And had that whole concept of social marketing been something in your thought before then or not? Because that's what hit me that so
No.
strongly when I encountered you and rare pride campaigns was just the application of kind of Madison Avenue techniques to conservation issues.
Yeah, well, sort of the term social marketing goes back to 1971. Kotler wrote about it. I don't think we had any idea that we were doing social marketing. I think what occurred to me was that very often the messages that would be put out by the forestry department at that time were boring and bland. And this is fairly typical of conservation. You know, you'd go into a community and say, if you cut down this forest, 16 tons of topsoil will wash down the river and go on the reef, etc., etc. And everyone would nod, but really they were nodding off to sleep and not nodding in acceptance of it. I think it occurred to me that to change people's behavior, you needed to do something different. And I thought, again, wasn't thinking of social marketing. I thought, well, how do you sell difficult products? Well, okay, the cigarette manufacturers don't tell you what's in the cigarette. They stick a guy on a horse and make you feel you're galloping across Marlborough country. You know, in those days, in the 60s and 70s, many of the men's cologne was made of musk. The musk is a gland on a deer that's located somewhere between its genitals and its navel. I don't think they talked about that when they were advertising me to splash on my cologne. What they did was they used emotions. In those days, it was, you know, sex and, you know, if you drive this car, you'll be, you know, a hero to the world. And so we thought the same thing. Maybe we should be using emotions rather than sort of the rational approach. And it was trial and error. It wasn't any, you know, it wasn't a eureka moment. And so Forestry Division started putting out materials that made the parrot the symbol of pride. And it worked. We got people's attention. Legislation was changed. Protected areas were set aside. People rallied to the cause. And ultimately, thanks to the work of the Forestry Department, the population of the parrots have slowly risen. And as you said, people know about it. I was just sent a video the other day of parrots in somebody's back garden that somebody had videoed and shared on social media. And those staff I worked with together under Gabriel Charles were my heroes, and we learned together things we did. Not everything worked.
But you had an ongoing laboratory there, and an
Yes.
island. I think an island was the perfect place for those kind of experiments to be going on, because you really, to my perception, blanketed the island with messages. I mean, it wasn't just through the schools.
No.
It wasn't through the churches, just through the churches. It was everywhere. I mean, passports.
Yeah.
Drinks. I forget. There were.
The telephone card had a parrot on it. It also had a bald eagle on it, so we could see which one of us had the more pretty-looking national bird. Yeah, it was everywhere. But as you said, it's easy when your island is 27 miles long and 14 miles wide, and there's a population of 140,000. You know, it's easier to get into every community. And also at that time, you know, I think there was 2 or maybe 3 radio stations and 1 or 2 television stations. So yes. And, you know, it wasn't like you had to pay tens of thousands of pounds to get a few minutes on the television. They would welcome anything. So yes, it was easier to get the message out.
Well, maybe easier in one way, but the fact is that nobody had thought of all this beforehand. So you were an incubator of all kinds of ideas. It was a great incubator.
Yeah, I think some people have written, Diogo has written sort of a history of social marketing, and he mentions that the first example is probably, you know, Smokey the Bear back in the 40s, and then Woodsy the Owl in the 70s. You know, don't give a hoot, don't pollute. But I think we were probably maybe one of the first to sort of package it and to share it with, first of all, other islands in the Caribbean, and then more widely. And now 60 countries, I think we've worked in.
Well, I think that's when I came on. It was being shared with other countries. There were other parrots also that were in critical danger of disappearing. There was the Rare Radio at the time, Rare Enterprises. There were a number of, they were all, I think that the entrepreneurial spirit was very, very strong from that beginning on St. Lucia. Would you agree? I mean, you had a receptive forestry department. You also were beginning to build a receptive a group at Rare headquarters. They said, okay, go for it.
Yeah, I mean, so I was 10 years with the government of St. Lucia with forestry, and then Rare came along and invited me to join the organization. It was very, very small at the time. It was just 2 or 3 of us, and to see if we could take the lessons learned from St. Lucia and share it with others and slowly scale it. And in those days, scale meant, 1 or 2 more places. Now it's hundreds of places. And under Brett Jenks, who became the CEO and then president of Rare at the time, he was really, big, hairy, audacious goals that I would never have thought of. I was thought maybe we could try it 1 place or 2 places. And under his leadership, the organization grew. And we needed to work out ways of packaging what we'd learned so we could share it with others. And that's really how we started. We went first to St. Vincent and then Dominica, and from there, the rest of the Caribbean, and on and on and on.
And then you start branching out to the Pacific, because and that's when I know I was taking a nature conservancy trip to Palau, and I hear about, I happened to mention Rare. Oh, Rare, we know Rare. They had several campaigns, turtles and that sort of thing, and the components, the principal components were usually a mascot and an issue that needed to be solved, right? A conservation issue.
We started the scaling process by writing a manual, literally like a cookery book. Just as, Betty Crocker or whatever would give you follow the recipe and you'd come up with it. And so we the first probably 100 campaigns that we ran after, when I first joined Rare, were run with a cookery book. And we would give it to the local campaign manager, always a local campaign manager, and then they would use the cookery book and we'd visit them 5 times. To help them on their way over the course of the first year. But that's not really scalable. You can't be shooting off all over the world, 5 times to Palau and then 5 times to the Bahamas. And so then we decided to put together a diploma course, and that brought the campaign managers together. And that did several things. It meant campaign managers could meet each other. They didn't just meet me or the Rare staff. They would meet each other, share lessons learned, and we could actually train them in a university setting. And so we worked with the University of Kent to develop a diploma course, and they would then come for 12 weeks, learn the basics, go home, do some audience research, because we always want to understand what the audience current behavior is, what those attitudes and drivers of that behavior are. And then they would run a campaign, and they would come back at the end and they would get a diploma. And that was another several hundred campaigns. And then we moved on to a master's.
And that's when I met you, because you just had Kent, and the campaign managers were far flung. I mean, give us a sense. They were literally around the globe, mostly in the tropics.
In pretty much all in the tropics at that time. But as you said, from Palau to the Philippines to Indonesia to Africa to South Africa to Gabon to all over the place.
And campaigns of all different sorts. I mean, the only really thing that I think that they all shared was a knotty conservation issue, but it was different in every place. And
yes, so we were pretty heterogeneous. We were driven as much by who would fund them as anything. They needed to have a local campaign manager, a local partner that would host them. So it could be an NGO. It might be a big NGO, World Wildlife Fund or Nature Conservancy. It could be a small NGO. In Palau, it was Palau Conservation Society. And they would nominate an individual. In those days, it was Yulap or Noe Yulap. We worked with 2 different campaign managers on 2 different programs there in Palau. And then, yes, they would run a campaign around a theme. So it could be, for example, you mentioned Palau, Yulap ran a campaign to try to get some new legislation for turtles. In fact, I heard he just recently in January won an award for that campaign, a national award. So it might be to pass a piece of legislation. It might be to change a particular behavior of a resource use behavior, or it might simply to get recognition for an organization, community support for that organization.
And so simultaneously with all this, you were, as I recall, documenting what was going on. You were constantly assessing and evaluating what was going well, what wasn't going well. And that has always been to me a hallmark of Rare, is that that self-assessment. And I remember just being kind of so intrigued by not just the social marketing and the entrepreneurial spirit, but the insistence on constantly evaluating and learning from those evaluations?
Yeah, it was, as an example of that, as I said, we used to use a manual and go visit them 5 times, but we realized that wasn't scalable. Also, those campaign managers didn't talk to one another, so there was no lesson sharing. Also, they worked incredibly hard on these campaigns, but they were not financially rewarded by Rare. They just got the same salary because we didn't pay them. They were paid locally. So we felt, well, if we brought them together, first of all, we could train them, because some of the old campaign managers, some of them were educators, some of them were simply forestry staff or NGO staff. So if we brought them together, we could train them in basic principles of social marketing, in doing basic research to understand the audience. Also, they would meet each other, and we wouldn't have to visit them so many times. We could visit them twice instead of 5 times. That would enable us to grow in scale. So yes, it's been an evolution, and the evolution continues to this day. Rare is still working in communities, still working with local people. The center of its work is still behavior and solutions to using behavior, but we're at a much greater scale because we've learned. And so now we do things not the same. So every across that time period, yes, we've been evolving.
Yeah. And the emphasis on people always has been so central and so strong, often when people think about conservation groups, they're thinking about landscape, species, that kind of thing. People have always been at the center. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Well, people are causing most of the problems, and therefore people have to be part of the solution. It's as simple as that. Yeah. And if you're not training people to continue the program, then it's not going to survive. So we've always, and I think, as I said, Rare's always believed in working with people, local people on the ground. It's changed over the years. So now we tend to work with municipalities, local mayors, fabulous mayors in the Philippines, and they nominate their staff, or provincial governments in other countries. But there's always a local people that's at the core of what Rare does and who we train. As I said, in the past, through degree programs or through diplomas, now short trainings. And indeed, right here and now, if anybody's interested, Rare does free trainings online. So if anyone's interested, they can do a 4-hour free training, or they can do a 3-day intensive training. So yes, we want to share tools.
But I think that it was one point that really differentiated Rare right from the beginning, was that, and lots of conservation groups doing wonderful work, but often the people in the community part was not as integrated into the work, and that's what I felt that was Rare's sweet spot, was always that emphasis on community. The training manuals, I kind of raised my eyebrows at that when I thought, oh gosh, training manuals, they often sit on shelves. Yours didn't. I saw that again and again, whether it was, again, Palau at Jellyfish Lake, was that right?
We walked a trail to Jellyfish Lake.
The trail, yeah. And I asked the guy, oh yeah, this is from I learned how to do this through my Rare, Rare training. And I could see that those were not only essential, they were tremendously meaningful to the people using them. And it was obviously very, very practical in the development of the skills and so forth of these local guides. I know that Kent went on to that expanded that diploma program where you had what, five centers, and
we had four Bogor Agricultural Institute that taught in Bahasa, Indonesia. Then we had in Kunming in Mandarin, and then we had Guadalajara, which taught in Spanish. So we were able to offer the diploma in 4 languages because, again, we wanted to try to reach as many people as possible. And I believe the training that I was talking about, the free training, I believe that's currently available in Spanish, Mandarin, English, and I think soon to be in Portuguese and French. So all those years later, we're still following that belief that we need to train more and more people, and they need to be given tools that are useful.
And then you eventually also developed one at was it a master's program at University of Texas at El Paso, UTEP?
Yeah, when the faculty staff in the University of Kent saw the work that was being done, one of them said to me, "This is much higher than a diploma. You should be giving these people much more. You should be giving them a master's degree." But when we dug into it, we found, well, if we had to negotiate with all 4 universities to change, every time we changed the curriculum, we'd have to get approval from the 4 universities because the diploma was given at that time in their name. So we said, well, in the end, it's much better to work with one university. And the University of Texas, El Paso was willing to grant a master's degree, and we could work with them, even though it was still taught in the sort of regional hubs. They got a master's degree. I think we've probably given 100 master's degrees. We don't follow that anymore because, again, it's not scalable, and we want to try to continue to scale. Yeah, that was an interesting evolution. But I think what you can see is there's an evolution from me doing it to training someone else, to producing a manual, then going to a diploma so that they can work together, and then going to a master's degree, and now going, because now I think people do it online. 40 years ago, people didn't do things online. I remember the floppy disk we had to put into the computer.
And, now everyone talks about scale, but you were actually, I don't even know that I remember hearing the word scale so much in those early days, but you were actually doing it. I mean, it was just, it was just happening. And there was almost a meteoric growth of rare. I'd say, I don't know, late 1990s and on through. I mean, it was exponentially growing all the time. To what do you attribute that?
Brett Jenks.
Okay. Yeah.
I would attribute a large amount of that to Brett and to the trustees that we brought on board, who were constantly empowering us, constantly inspiring us, constantly pushing harder and harder and harder to do more and more and more, and to say that we need to scale. It's not good enough just to, if you have a tool, if you have a saw, most people need a saw. It's only one piece of a toolbox. You can't build a house with only a saw, but it's pretty useful to have together with your hammer and your chisel and all of these other things. Well, let's get the saw out to as many people as we can. And so that's what we've been trying to do. It's one tool in a toolbox. This is not a sort of magic bullet. But as I said, the toolbox was pretty sparse when I began conservation. If we can add more and more tools to it, that's helping the conservation practitioners. And,
with this meteoric growth, at the same time, I'd say that there have been a lot of ingredients to the rare culture that have remained constant. The entrepreneurial spirit, the can-do attitude, the optimism. I always point to the fun. I mean, it was actually always fun to be with. Because conservation can be a grim business at times, but there was always a sense of, no, we've got a solution. We can do this. The emphasis on people. And would you agree with that? Were there other things?
Yeah, I think all of those things, and I think focus.
Okay.
I think focus. I think at one time, as you rightly mentioned, we ran 3 programs: a family planning program, which was Rare Radio, run by Aline Regis, very successful, a really, really innovative program. When Brett first joined Rare, we had an ecotourism program that trained people how to speak English and interpret nature, so that in Central America, we could use local guides. They didn't have to rely on other guides because of the language problem. These were very, very successful, award-winning programs. But back then, we couldn't afford to run and scale all of them. So Rare had to focus. And I think that's very brave, because we had to move away from multiple very successful programs. And that's not easy to do, and to focus. And I think that's the beauty of Rare. Rare is focused on using and developing and evolving tools related to promoting behavior change, people-centered solutions, working with people. And I think that's brave to do, because everyone likes to do 50 different things,
Yeah, and it's a real challenge. It's one of the greatest challenges of any enterprise is defining and maintaining focus.
And also not being afraid to try to take on more complex threats. So in the old days, a campaign might be needed to build community support to pass a piece of legislation, or to build support around a new protected area. Relatively simple. now we're working with, sustainable fisheries, where you're working with tens of thousands of fishermen whose livelihoods depend on it, and the behavior you're promoting is pretty pretty important, and I think that's a symbol of Rare too, to continue to evolve and take on new challenges, global challenges, things that are really meaningful, at a global scale.
But to retain the kind of the ethos and that core culture that I think is always defined Rare.
Yeah, and I think it's still there. It's amazing. And that's what keeps me so proud of the organization. That I've retired now, so it's nearly 5 years since I retired, and still my passion and my heart are there. Well, actually my heart's in St. Lucia, but the rest of me is here. But yeah, still passionate about
and the C4C workshops that you initiated and established, are they still going on?
Yes, I think.
Tell us a little bit about that. Now I've even forgotten what it stands for.
Well, so what happened was that we decided we wanted to, before we're heterogeneous, as you rightly said, we could work anywhere with any threat all over the place. But that wasn't very easy to scale. And also we couldn't learn so much. If one day you're working on a taimen in Mongolia, and the next you're working on a tiger in China, and the next you're working, this doesn't give the ability to collect data, because the audiences are very different, the threats are very different. So Rare decided to hone in geographically and thematically. So we would only now work in a handful of countries, for example, the Philippines, Indonesia, Mozambique, Brazil, Honduras, and with a select number of themes. Lands for Life, which is sustainable agriculture, Fish Forever, which is nearshore fishing. So now we're focused in far fewer countries, far less threats, but we could learn much more, and we could put staff in those countries to help them be more sustainable. But in doing that, it meant that if anyone else came to Rare saying, well, we want your help with A, B, and C, well, you're not in this country and you're not with that threat, sorry, we can't help you. So we developed C4C, which is like a 10-day workshop. And now you have these trainings I just mentioned, online trainings, so that those people who weren't working in a region that we were focused on, or with a threat we were focused on, we could still help them in some way. They may not get the main course, but they got a damn good hors d'oeuvre that they could enjoy and get a flavor for what we do. And so, yes, and if people are interested, go online, look at the BE Center. It's under Rare's website. There is a link. You can learn about these trainings. There's a Beehive, I believe it's June the 11th, which is kind of a show that will stimulate people's attention and give them a flavor of what we do. The website's really good, and I'm so proud of it.
And I remember now, it's Campaigning for Conservation.
Yes, C4C, Campaigning for Conservation.
Yeah. And then, it's Rare's developed its own vocabulary, as all conservation groups do in their evolution, but solutionology is another word that has cropped up and is used a lot. So just tell us how you think about solutionology and bright spots. And
well, yeah, I think I use a slightly different term, but I've always liked the Chinese proverb, it's better to light a candle than curse the darkness. I've always believed that ever since I was a student. I know that, Kennedy used it and Roosevelt used it, but, it really is true. One person lights a candle. Okay, it's not going to make a great difference, but it's a step in the right direction. If everybody lights a candle, then there's brightness and hope. And that's really what it is, I think. Instead of looking at the problem, let's look for solutions. Let's try them. Let's learn fast. Candles can flicker out very quickly with the slightest wind, or they can stay bright. And so that's my belief, and try things. And that's how it really started in St. Lucia with, as I said, with Michael Bob, Gabriel Charles, Aline, all these great people. We just tried things. It's not like everything worked. And yes, I think that's to this day. And so be solutionologists. Try to think of the solution.
I love that. I love that explanation.
Don't give up.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm just going to mention to everyone this book that Paul has written, The History of Rare, which Stephanie tells me there are only a few copies of left. I'm going to recommend that we get it republished if need be, because all staff members and board members should have this. It tells it's got a bit of a cookbook flavor to it too, Paul.
Right.
Because it's while it's history, you also at the end of each chapter do lessons or the lessons learned or chapter insights, and throughout you have just highlighted pages of key points in Rare's evolution, which I think are instructive for anyone working in this field.
Well,
So,
as I was saying to Brett some time ago, I'm happy to update it because it's a little bit out of date. So before we do anything with it, I'm happy to update it. But yeah, that's really was written for staff just to give a history, because I think that unless you know where you've come from,
yeah,
it's difficult to know what your future is.
that's right. And
You
it's
really need to
important.
understand.
Yeah, it's important to know that history, because that really is the DNA of the group, which has fortunately survived in robust conditions. So I'm glad for that.
You don't want to repeat the mistakes you made before just because you don't know that you made them. So yeah.
I'm going to ask Stephanie if there are some questions in the chat, because I think the most important is really any interchange that others may have and questions you might have for Paul.
Yeah, absolutely. We are getting several questions, and just a quick reminder to everybody to please enter your questions into the Q&A app. If we don't get to all of your questions, we will do our best to follow up to respond to each of you. I know we have a limited amount of time. So with that, Wendy and Paul, the first question I have is, actually, this is for Paul. Can you share an example of where you had to work with extremely limited resources, but were still able to see big results?
Well, I mean, go back to those days, as I said, when I joined forestry in St. Lucia back in the late 70s. The forestry department had almost no money at all. And so we had to, scrunt is the word I think they would probably use now, but basically go to local businesses. So for example, we wanted to put out a newspaper that would come out once a month in the newspaper, in the national newspaper as an insert, and then also copies be made available to every single school. It was called Bush Talk. It was written by a local person. I think we did more than 100 issues, and a local supermarket paid for it, and they got an advert on the back, and it went into every single school. Billboards, we would go to the local hardware store and see if they had some plywood that they could donate to us, and then go to an artist and ask them to do it for free. And so basically the campaign that I talked about in those days was run on almost no money at all. To try to bring in additional money, or at least to show the government that conservation could pay, the forestry department set up a rainforest walk. This was a walk through the center of the island where people could see parrots and other wildlife, and it was for tourists. Most tourists that came to St. Lucia spent most of the time on the beach, and they got red and sunburnt. Well, we could turn them green by taking them into the forest for a little while, and so that raised money. It raised money for the community because the community were paid to taxi drivers and picnics. It supported the local tour companies that organized it and the hotels. And so, yes, and so we had to raise money any which way. And all the early campaigns were relatively inexpensive. People donate things.
And I have to add that we were constantly, it seemed, in the red the first years that I was there. But things, you kept at it. And there was just such a strong belief and support for, the whole idea of what Rare was doing. Go ahead, Stephanie.
Yeah, great. So this one is for Wendy. What is the driving force behind your support for conservation? What made you a conservationist?
Oh gosh, I just think the love for all the wondrous species and landscapes in the world. I mean, I think we've been given an incredible natural legacy, and I think it's our job to care for that. And it's as simple as that. I love all things wild. And I just want to do my part, but to make sure that succeeding generations know and experience that same natural wonder.
That's great. So this one is a question to both. From where you sit, do you see enough conservation groups embracing behavior change as a key strategy for impact?
Go ahead, Paul.
Well, I certainly see many, many, many more organizations using it and recognizing that the enormous importance of involving local people and promoting sustainable behaviors. So I think it's very, very heartening. As I said, 47 years ago when I started, almost nobody was. So I think it's tremendous. And as I said, it's a tool in a toolbox. Let's make sure we don't lose the other tools, and let's make sure we keep developing new tools to add to that toolbox, because we certainly need them. And, you know, the challenges we face now, you know, the biodiversity plan 30 by 30, you know, 30% of the land and waters protected by 2030. These are enormous challenges we face. We're going to need every tool in the toolbox, and I think RARE can contribute and has contributed to that toolbox and will continue to contribute, as will all the other organizations, you know, TNC, WWF, WCS, all of them, big and small. You know, Little Plough Conservation Society, fabulous people down there. It's one of the most beautiful places on earth.
And I just add to that I think almost all conservation groups recognize the need, but don't quite know how to do it. And I think that's where RARE has excelled in developing those tools that Paul's talking about to meaningfully and effectively engage individuals and communities.
Thanks. All right, next one. Paul and Wendy, thank you for all the information today. I was wondering, what strategies do you think are most effective in social marketing to shift public perceptions positively towards less popular species like reptiles and amphibians in agricultural areas?
Okay, well, yeah. Okay, so, I mean, I've always been very strong proponent of using emotions. I mean, this goes back obviously to the name of Pride. So I believe that emotions are a key component, but they're only one of many techniques in the social marketing toolbox of its own. And again, join the beehive, join the trainings. But you talk about if it's an uncharismatic species, what we would do then is focus on the habitat that species lives in. So I won't name which place it was, but there was a particular place that has a very rare warbler, which wasn't particularly attractive, but it also had a parrot in the same habitat, lives in the same habitat. Well, they wanted us to work on the warbler. I said it would be a hell of a lot easier to work on the parrot and have the area protected for the parrot, because the warbler lives in the same habitat. And so a campaign was run for the parrot, a protected area was established, and I assume that the warbler is enjoying that habitat as much. So, you know, you don't have to focus directly on the species. You can get around it that way. And you talk about uncharismatic. I gave a lecture, some Americans would know it, but I gave a lecture at a university, and somebody said to me, one of the questions from the audience said, well, what species wouldn't you choose? And I said, well, you probably wouldn't choose a slug. Well, it so happened that university, I think, has a slug as its like emblem. So I was shouted at.
And I think you think of, you know, people like Steve Irwin, who, you know, celebrated just about everything in the natural world. So I think the appeal to the emotions, the enthusiasm, all of that. I mean, I know that person that I know, Harry Green, who's written Snakes of the World, is his big campaign, his own personal campaign, is to get people more understanding of and interested in snakes and, you know, and their importance in the whole ecosystem. And he does it with these wonderful, he does a lot of field trips and so forth. But so I think the emotional appeal is just key.
Yeah, I mean, if you can sell cigarettes and all these things and Coca-Cola, yes, I mean, yeah. Yeah. And I think also making people feel part of something bigger than themselves. Yeah. You know, it's the tribal instinct in us. You know, you see pride emanate, you go to a football match or a basketball match or whatever, and you see, you know, you weren't born supporting Manchester United. You know, pride is very powerful. You know, people stand, you know, hand on heart in front of a flag. And if you look at the corporate, you know, you remember Pepsi had, you know, what was it? Come alive for your Pepsi generation, you know, as if drinking Pepsi somehow made you part of an enormous group. They're using the same emotions, not telling you what's in the Pepsi.
And also, I think, Paul, just at your first experience with the St. Lucia Parrot Show, that just making people aware, because I always say that ignorance and indifference are the greatest threats to conservation. And if people don't know about something, you know, then they don't care about it. And so that's another key ingredient is just bringing these, and it's sometimes maybe something very, very obscure, like some particular insect, but which is key to pollinating some, you know, tremendous plant or some very particular plant. And the more we know, then the more we're going to understand the relevance of all of that to the system. And then the more we're going to want to help support it and preserve it.
Yeah, and I think what every campaign that RARE's done and still does begins with an analysis of the audience whose behavior we're hoping to change. And what we really want to do is we want the audience to adopt the behavior because they want to, not because we're forcing them to. We want them to self-adopt. Yeah. And so we do big surveys at the beginning. They're getting more and more complex as we've learned more and more how to understand the audience. So that's really important, understanding the audience, using emotional appeals, making the new behavior as attractive as possible and as easy to adopt as possible, removing any barriers that get in the way, perhaps creating barriers for the behavior we don't want used by either making it more difficult or more socially unacceptable. Also the power of being part of a group, of being, social norms. Everyone wants to be part of a group. Nobody wants to be few people want to be the outsider. And really what we tried to do in the early campaigns was, think of a wave, other than a tsunami, but an ordinary wave breaking on the shore. You don't see the erosion taking place, but each wave moves a few grains and more waves come, and over time it erodes the coastline. And that was what we wanted to hit, wave after wave after wave of messages and materials that slowly would erode ignorance, apathy, lack of understanding. And this is not because people were deliberately ignorant, it's because people have busy lives to get on with, but little by little to get them to think about have new ways of thinking.
Stephanie, another one.
Yeah, well, I think this was somewhat related, but a little different. Wendy, are you still leading bird walks? Does a community-centered conservation approach work in Central Park as well as it did in St. Lucia?
I'd say it does. Although I'm not in Central Park, I'm in Illinois now. Yeah, and I still do lead bird walks. And I still, that's a very, what I call low level, probably, activity, but I think it's important too, because I can't tell you how many people were just here in Illinois have lived in an area that have got just thousands of acres of forest preserves, who've never been to those places. And so it's just as Paul says, a little by little process. And I've seen untold numbers grow from total unawareness of, in this case, the avian world, to being avid, committed, and almost fervent birders. So, and hopefully conservationists. Next one. I'm going to keep it going because I know there are quite a few.
Yeah, there's a lot. All right, this is from Chris Cox.
Oh.
With a note to Paul. So great to see you. Over the many years, what do you see as the single common success factor in behavioral change for conservation that still resonates today?
Chris, wonderful. This is a very, very dear friend from a very long time ago. Chris was in St. Lucia. So yeah, Chris, I think committed local people who are passionate, who see this as a vocation, they're the secret sauce, really. And then in giving them the tools that they can use to transform the societies that they live in. And many of those people, you're one yourself, Chris. Give people the tools they need, the support they need, and they can do wonders. And it goes back to, light a candle is better than cursing the darkness. And there are many candles out there. And I'm so privileged to have worked with so many incredible local people, not hugely paid, not got great resources, just a passion to get work done.
People who care.
People who care.
Yeah. Stephanie?
All right. So 20 years ago, it seemed that much of the conservation world was studying and documenting declines, while RARE was the brilliant exception, inventing, sourcing, and scaling solutions. What's changed?
What's changed in RARE, or what's changed? I think part of it is that more and more tools are available to the conservation toolbox. I think people are more aware of the plight of the planet now than they perhaps were. They just need to be encouraged to believe that they can make a difference, because a lot of people feel despondent. I mean, it can be really bad listening to the news. You feel there's no hope. That's not a great way to get people to change their behavior, So I think is give people hope, give people the tools that they can use, get more and more people trained up using these tools. And I'm a hopeful person. I don't think every species will survive, but let's hope more and more will.
And I think, Paul, again, comes out in your book too, teaching how, because lots of people they feel helpless because they're not quite sure how. Everybody can make a difference. Every single individual can make a difference. Either it's a small one or a big one, but everything in between, but every one of us can make a difference. And that's what we should wake up thinking about every day.
6 billion small steps is
Yeah.
one hell of a journey. If everybody did a little something.
All
Okay,
right,
Stephanie.
we have time for 2 more questions. This one, what are you both most proud of in your careers?
Oh gosh.
I'm most proud of working with an incredible set of people, both within the organization and outside. That's what makes me most proud. You know, I think we've probably had 400 campaign managers, of which I've probably personally known several hundred of them. These are my heroes. These are the people that kept me going, literally kept me going. And yeah, that's what I'm most proud of having worked in beautiful places with fantastic people.
And I think my answer would be similar. I don't so much use the word proud of. I'm just grateful for really having working with so many wonderful people. And in my case, it's particularly with children. Because they have a natural attraction to and love of the natural world. They just, you see little kids down on their knees looking at ants and stuff. And so often it just gets snuffed out. Well, I love working with them and keeping that flame of interest alive and letting it, really, I don't know what the verb is, but anyway, I'm changing metaphors, but blossom.
It's a beautiful world.
Yeah.
It's a beautiful world.
Yeah. Stephanie?
Yep. All right. So last question. I know we have many more and we will try to follow up with all of you. But what inspires you now? What makes you hopeful for the future of conservation?
Well, for me, it goes back to the same, often to young people, because I see their brightness, their hopes, their can-do spirit, and their curiosity. I mean, the curiosity is just such a powerful dimension of human behavior, and I love nourishing that native sense of curiosity that everybody has. And so again, so often, as you said at the beginning, Paul, some of the messages they get are so boring and it just turns off. We want to keep that curiosity burning all the time because it is an incredibly interesting, diverse, astonishing world that we live in, and learning about it and learning how we can keep it that way and even better is just a wonderful privilege.
Yeah, I think we can be inspired and hopeful. I mean, we had nothing whatsoever to do with it, but there's a bird in England called the red kite. When I was a young birder 40 years ago, 50 years ago, it was extremely rare. There was a handful of them. I just saw one out the window not long ago from where I am now. You know, this is a bird that's rebounded from very, very rare. Nothing to do with the organization or me, nothing to do with it. But there's hope out there. Things do rebound. It's not all dismal. And if we all play our part, I think we can do our best. That's all we can hope for, right? Do our best.
And there's a wonderful interest in and participation in restoration efforts, I think, in Great Britain, in Europe, in all parts. I can't think of any part of the world really where there aren't individuals and groups and communities who are really pouring themselves into restoring what is very special to their own area.
But I just want to say that I've seen, because people are texting, you know, I can see people coming. I see some names on there I haven't spoken to for a very, very, very long time, including colleagues from St. Lucia I left St. Lucia over 25 years ago, and there's some names up there, Aline and Chris Cox and others. Fabulous, fabulous. And yeah.
Yeah. And I'm seeing a lot too.
There's lots of old rare board members as well. So my heart goes out to everyone.
Yeah, and I see some questions addressed to tourism too, which I think is really important. I think that's an incredibly important topic and a big one to tackle. So Paul, I've got to say, it's a privilege to be here with you. The only thing would be better is if we were in person. But,
thank you so much, Wendy, and Stephanie. Thank you, and
thanks,
everyone
Stephanie.
that tuned in. I hope you got something
Absolutely,
from
yep.
it. I really appreciate you taking the time out from your busy schedules to join us for this conversation. Thank everybody, and yeah, happy Earth Day from yesterday. Be hopeful, and let's all play our part.
That's exactly right. Thanks so much, everyone.